my last of the five is big and complicated, and I don't know how much I can go into it, but so it may not be completely clear, but my number five is the site of Herodium. So when Herod the Great ruled from 40 BC until he died in the year 4 BC, right? And while Herod ruled, he established a number of fortified desert palaces like Masada. Masada is simply actually the most famous of the fortified desert palaces that Herod built. These fortified desert palaces are located along the southern frontier of his kingdom, and they help to protect the southern frontier. They also were intended to serve as potential places of refuge in case of a Jewish revolt. So Herod feared, because he was not liked by the Jews, that they might try and revolt against him and kill him. And he built these fortified palaces out in the middle of the desert so that he could take refuge if he had to. So very, very close to Bethlehem, less than 5 miles from Bethlehem, is one of these fortified desert palaces. It's called Herodium. It served not only as a fortified desert palace, it also served as an administrative center. And it's unusual in many ways. And one of the things that makes it unusual is it is the only one of Herod's fortified desert palaces that he established from scratch. All the others were sites that had been fortified by his Hasmonean predecessors, the Maccabees. Have fortified all the others, including Masada. Herodium is the only one he established from scratch on that spot. Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, says that Herod built it at that spot to commemorate a battle that he won early in his reign against the Hasmoneans, against the Maccabees. So it's unusual in that, and it's unusual because it's the only site. Herod, when he built things, he always named them after people, but he always named them after other people. Herodium is the only site that he named after himself. He called it Herodium, and he apparently called it in his own name. He named it after himself because right from the start, he planned it to serve as his final resting place. And indeed, Josephus tells us that when Herod died in the year 4 BC in Jericho, he was at his winter palace in Jericho when he died, his body was brought by procession and buried at Herodium. Now, beginning in the 1980s, an Israeli archaeologist named Ehud Netzer started digging at Herodium. Ehud Netzer was an Israeli archaeologist. You asked for names. He was one of my undergraduate professors. He excavated many of Herod's sites during his lifetime. Unfortunately, tragically, he died accidentally in 2010 at Herodium. He actually was leaning on a railing, and it collapsed, and he tumbled over the edge of the cliff, and he died. It's very tragic, very tragic. But anyway, beginning in the 1980s, Ehud Netzer literally dug at Herodium for decades. And one of the things that he was looking for was Herod's tomb. Where was Herod buried at Herodium? Josephus says he was buried at Herodium. The site's named in honor of Herod. Where's his tomb? So Netzer literally spent decades, and we didn't know. Now, Herodium is a very interesting site because it's a mountain, but it's all artificial. Herod literally created a cone-shaped mountain. It looks like a volcano. And there were buildings in sort of like the crater of the volcano at the top, palatial buildings inside the crater. And there were also buildings at the base of the mountain. But the mountain itself is this huge artificial mountain. And you can actually, it's so big that you can see it from Jerusalem. You can stand on top of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem and you can see Herodium. You can actually see it from across the Dead Sea. If you go to Machaerus on the other side of the Dead Sea, which is another one of Herod's fortified desert palaces, you look across, you can see Herodium on the horizon. So it's visible for great distances. It sticks up out of the landscape. Very conspicuous. So there was a lot of debate about where Herod was buried at Herodium. Was he buried inside the mountain? Was he buried at the base of the mountain? Nobody knew. And in 2007, Ehud Netzer discovered the tomb. It was located on the side of the mountain. It was located halfway down the slope. So we always thought it was on top, it was below. No, it was halfway up. But what's so interesting is that the tomb is a mausoleum building, meaning it was a freestanding structure. Freestanding, so it had like a big sort of elevated stone base. And then on top of that, it had a circular building with a conical roof. And the circular building was surrounded by 18 Ionic columns, which is a particular kind of Greek column. So it was in ruins, of course, but they found all of the different parts of it. And they also found, the excavators found the remains of 3 sarcophagi, which are coffins made of stone. And one of them is of a beautiful red stone, very finely carved. And although there's no inscription, the excavators suggest, and I think it's reasonable, that was actually the sarcophagus of Herod himself.
Wow, incredible.
So now, for the first time, and what I think is so important about this is because Herod, we don't have any writings of Herod. We only know about Herod from other people who wrote about him. And the other people who wrote about Herod that we have their information today were all very negative about him, right? I mean, apparently, at least justifiably so for some reasons, right?
So we have information about him from the New Testament and Josephus.
Exactly.
And are there any other sources?
No, well, contemporary sources, that's pretty much, no, that's not true, actually. We do also have, but you're right. Our main sources are Josephus and the New Testament. And so now what we have for the first time is Herod telling us how he wanted to be remembered. He's representing himself to us, right? He built his everlasting memorial, and in that everlasting memorial, he's reflecting how he wants to be remembered. Now, I published an article within the last month that came out, analyzing the tomb of Herod at Herodium. And if you look at it, it's very interesting and very complex, because on the one hand, the tomb is modeled after the tombs of very famous people of antiquity like Alexander the Great and Augustus. So on the one hand, Herod is situating himself within this sort of tradition, this Hellenistic, Greek Hellenistic Roman tradition of men who eventually become gods, right? Because Alexander and Augustus were both worshipped as gods after their death. So on the one hand, he's situating himself like that, but I also think that there's an important Jewish component here, and that is the location of Herodium overlooking Bethlehem. I think that Herod, and so what I think Herod was trying to do was to, let me put it this way. Herod could situate himself in the tradition of deified rulers, deified emperors like Augustus and Alexander in the Greek and Roman world. But that wasn't going to fly with the Jewish population. For the Jewish population, to be a legitimate king, you had to be a Messiah. Messiah, of course, in Hebrew simply means the anointed one, right? If you wanted to be a legitimate royal Messiah, royal, which is what Herod was. He wasn't priestly, right? He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a priest. He was a king. If you want to be in the eyes of the Jews, a true, legitimate royal Messiah, you have to be descended from
David.
Where is Herodium built? It's overlooking Bethlehem.
That's so
I think now, already a number of decades ago, a very famous scholar named Abraham Shalit wrote a big book about Herod the Great, which unfortunately was never published in English. It was only published in German and Hebrew, so nobody reads it. And he was a very important scholar. He has a very long discussion in his book suggesting, not on the basis of Herodium, but suggesting that in fact Herod claimed to be the Davidic Messiah. And he based this on a passage in Josephus, where Josephus says that Herod claimed to rule by the will of God. And what Shalit suggested is that if you look at everything that Herod did, and especially rebuilding the Jerusalem temple on this gigantic scale, right? It was to show that he had fulfilled the expectations associated with a Davidic Messiah.
Wow.
So I think that part of the message of the tomb of Herod at Herodium is to broadcast Herod's claims to be or to have fulfilled the expectations associated with a Davidic Messiah. And I think that explains the location, which literally physically dominates or overshadows Bethlehem. And that, I think, may be reflected in the episode of the massacre of the innocents in the Gospel of Matthew. Right? Now, scholars debate whether the massacre of the innocents is historical or not. So scholars don't know if Herod actually did do something like that or not. There's no agreement. But that doesn't matter to me. I think that what we see in the story of the massacre of the innocents is a response, one response to Herod's claims. And what does Matthew keep saying over and over again? He keeps saying over and over again. And in fact, he starts with this whole thing about the lineage of Jesus, right?
Yes.
The whole point is to show that Jesus is descended from David, right? And that Jesus is the true Messiah, and that Herod is not only not the Messiah, he's the antithesis of the Messiah, because he tried to have the true Messiah killed, right?
Herod was not even Jewish, right? He was an Edomite.
He was, well, that's a really interesting question. Herod was, it's a really bad term to use, but he was half Jewish in the sense that his father was Jewish through forced conversion. His grandfather had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Maccabees, by the Hasmoneans, right? So 3 generations before Herod, his family had been forcibly converted to Judaism. They were Idumeans. They were descendants of the Edomites. Herod's mother was an Nabatean woman. She was not Jewish. Now, today, of course, according to Jewish law, the principle is matrilineal descent, right? So the mother now, according to Jewish law now, determines if you're Jewish or not, right? If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish, according to Jewish law today. But so according to that law, Herod would not be Jewish, right? But it's not clear that that law was universally accepted in the time of Herod, right? So today it's an accepted principle, not clear that that was widely accepted. So anyway, I mean, Herod's an interesting character because if you look at what he does in Judea, the area around Jerusalem and the environs, he's pretty much sticking to, Jewish practices, right? And he rebuilds the Jerusalem temple. But then you look at sites like Caesarea, for example. At Caesarea, Herod dedicated a pagan Roman temple in honor of Augustus.
Yes.
Right? Same thing at Samaria. So it's a kind of interesting thing. What did Herod think of himself, right? I think it's more complex than saying he thought of himself as a Jew or not a Jew. I think actually Herod may have had a somewhat inclusive Roman view. By an inclusive Roman view, I mean a view which said that all deities, all gods deserve respect, and it's not an exclusive, just, you worship only one God. But anyway, I think it's complicated. So anyway, I think the discovery of the mausoleum, the tomb of Herod at Herodium, is extremely important because, first of all, it sheds light on this key figure in Christian tradition and in general. And it also shows us how complex this world was, right? And I also think that it helps understand the story of the massacre of the innocents, this tradition that we have in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Which I think reflects one response to Herod's claim of messianism.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing those details.
Yeah, sure.